Hey guys, what's up? Oftentimes, when you get into historical linguistics, you hear a lot about how ubiquitous lenition is, lenition being the softening of consonants. There's a lot of discussion about how humans naturally want to make their language easier to pronounce, so they get lazy with it and a bunch of hard sounds get softened. So through all the stories about what happened to the voiceless plosives in Grimm's Law, or the breathy plosives in Pre-Hellenic and Pre-Italic, or the intervocalic voiced plosives in Spanish and also Proto-Germanic, many people question how languages even still distinguish sounds and wonder, are we heading toward a future where all languages are incomprehensible clumps of blobby vowels? In fact, no. It's less famous, but languages still do a fair amount of fortition, the opposite of lenition, where sounds get harder. And in order to provide everyone with reassurance that blob languages are not the future, in this video, I'm gonna go through some situations where fortition could happen and provide many examples where it did happen. Let's go! So to start, I'll talk about a type of fortition that's relatively easy to understand. Sometimes, a fricative can be considered hard to pronounce. Think of any cross-linguistically rare phoneme that happens to be a fricative. In that case, sometimes the speakers may just shift it to the plosive in the same place of articulation. A well-known example of this is all the times that the interdentals th and the became t and d. For example, every Germanic language except Icelandic and English made the shift at some point. To give the timeline, in Proto-Germanic, there was an initial th phoneme along with the as an allophone of d intervocalically. But later on, some Germanic languages also developed the as an intervocalic and word initial allophone of th. Then, many of those languages did fortition, and whether that sound was th or the before the shift determined whether it became t or d afterwards. Hence, now we have d in the West Germanic languages, but t in the North Germanic languages. The Semitic languages also did a fair amount of this, with the most consistent example being Aramaic, always fortiting th and the to t and d. Yes, fortite is the verb form. Fortify can also be used. Arabic also did this, but less consistently. Depending on the dialect and exact environment, th and the could either have become t and d or s and z, which are both more common sounds, but that's not fortition since they're still fricatives. For this reason, initially Hebrew doesn't count either, as from Proto-Semitic it shifted th to sh and the to z, all fricatives, but it did do fortition of th to t and the to d later on. Biblical Hebrew did allophonic spirantization, which included t to th and d to the, but during the diaspora period, some dialects, especially Sephardic Hebrew, merged those sounds back together when they were too difficult for the speakers who were then speaking primarily Ladino to pronounce. So there's fortition there as well. But now I get the point. Fortition of th and the is very common. For the, it's even found in Future American. Yeah, I said it. So what about some other rare fricatives that fortify a lot? Well, one of them is the voiced bilabial fricative v, which typically goes one of two ways. It often becomes v, like in most Romance languages, and also most Germanic languages, and that's a lateral move in terms of hardness, but sometimes it may become b, as it did in Spanish and Catalan at the beginnings of words. There's also the voiced velar fricative g, which likewise can fortite to g, as it did word initially in all Germanic languages except Dutch. Well, if you subscribe to the theory that that sound in Proto-Germanic was g word initially, which isn't 100% certain. This also happened in the same fashion that the to d did in several dialects of post-biblical Hebrew. And finally, there's the voiceless version of this. Sometimes ch may fortify to k. The examples of this are rare, but they come up in a very interesting, fairly plausible theory about Proto-Indo-Europeans' evolution into Proto-Germanic. Cowgill's Law. Remember the laryngeals and how they almost always disappeared? Well, as for when they didn't, Cowgill's Law basically says that if there was laryngeal 3, which I generally pronounce hua, between a sonorant and wa, then the hua would fortite to k. This is very specific, so there aren't many examples, but the best one I know is the first-person dual accusative pronoun nhue, which became unk in Proto-Germanic. And you may think this doesn't matter anymore since it's dual, but the insular West Norse languages actually kept this form rather than the plural as the new plural pronoun, namely Icelandic okur and Faroese okkun. Those gs are directly descended from laryngeal 3. Pretty cool. Alright, for our next general cause of fortition, we're going to German because now we're talking about chain shifts. Basically, a chain shift is any sound shift where one sound or set of sounds moves, and then a bunch of other sounds follow suit in some sort of pattern. They're fairly common in vowels. For example, the English Great Vowel Shift was a chain shift, as well as the contemporary Northern City Shift and California Vowel Shift in American English. But consonants can go through chain shifts too, with one of the more famous examples being the High German consonant shift. Taking place from about 300 to 700 AD in pre-Old High German, it started with regular lenition as nod-word initial ungeminated voiceless plosives p, t, and k spirantized to voiceless fricatives f, s, and ch. The word initial and geminated sounds became affricated, which is also technically lenition, but we care more about what happened elsewhere. So following this, there was a vacant space at the voiceless plosives, which got snagged by the voiced plosives. So then what replaced the voiced plosives? That's right, the voiced fricatives. So there's our fortition. V, the, and g became b, d, and g. Therefore, Proto-West Germanic givan is now German geben, and thak, which became thak, is now dach. So effectively, we have a situation where an unlikely sound shift was caused by a couple likelier shifts pulling it into existence. I can't actually think of any more examples of fortition happening within a chain shift, but it's a big world. You know of any? Leave them in the comments. So next up, one situation where consonants can harden is around nasals because sometimes fricatives are hard to articulate there and a plosive would provide better contrast. As such, this is technically also a form of dissimilation. For our purposes, I will mention that the only section on the Wikipedia page about fortition dedicated to a specific type of it is in fact about post-nasal fortition, specifically in several Bantu languages, and I'll have to leave it at that because I haven't studied any of them. What I have studied though is Icelandic, a language with pre-nasal fortition. In fact, my last video is all about Icelandic. How convenient, it's almost like I set it out that way. Anyway, on prenasal fortition, Icelandic has an allophone where f becomes p when before n, like in sap. Although it can also happen before l, like in kartapla. Yeah, recycled examples, whatever. So that can happen, but Icelandic has a lot more to offer in terms of fortition. Now we'll talk about epenthesis. Epenthesis is simply any time a sound is inserted between two other sounds in order to break up awkward combinations of sounds. Either consonants or vowels can be inserted epenthetically, but for us, we care about consonants specifically because consonant epenthesis is, by definition, basically always fortition. In fact, you could say that consonant epenthesis represents the essence of fortition because humans are literally putting consonants into their speech to prevent it from getting too vowel-y. Since we were just talking about Icelandic, I'll pick up with that. Icelandic has several situations that call for epenthetic t, particularly between two other non-plosive consonants that don't agree with each other. It can be found between erhet, erren, eshet, and essen, like in haukart, björt, verslun, and snjór. There's also a t inserted anytime there's a geminated or doubled l, like in eldfjall. Outside of Icelandic, other languages can sometimes use plosives as separators too, like in English with the word hamster, which normally has an epenthetic p between the m and s. You may also hear the word else pronounced else with an intrusive t just like Icelandic, although I don't personally do that myself. But so far, we've only talked about plosives being inserted between softer consonants. We can move both of those down on the hardness scale, and then we get the real way that languages avoid becoming too blobby. Liquid epenthesis between vowels. So basically, vowels can sometimes go right next to each other in consecutive syllables, and this is called hiatus. Many languages, such as Greek, Hebrew, and Japanese, have no problems with hiatus. But some others will avoid it at all costs, especially English. American English is relatively less extreme about avoiding hiatus, generally just inserting a y after e or a w after any back vowels, most commonly between words. But British English prevents hiatus at all costs, and in addition to what I said about American English, British English separates all other vowels with a feature that really sticks out, intrusive R. Yeah, it's pretty noticeable when a r sound that otherwise isn't there gets spoken, and it's specifically there to break up vowels, like in I saw it. There's this great video by Dr. Jeff Lindsay about this. It actually explains the problems with standard British IPA, and I've shared it for that purpose before, but the video is primarily about how British English avoids hiatus. And this separation of the softest sounds with slightly less soft sounds is effectively fortition. And finally, let's just keep talking about liquids, because sometimes liquids themselves can feel too airy and will get fortified into a fricative or even an affricate or plosive in a subsequent step. At first, this might not make sense, and it didn't to me until I learned one very surprising anatomical fun fact. The natural resting spot of the tongue is on the roof of the mouth, not the bottom. Yeah, despite everything you've heard about like gravity and all that, our bodies naturally hold the tongue up there on the top, and now you're definitely trying to feel it. Anyway, there are two main liquids that often become obstruents from people pronouncing them harder. The first one is w, which could forti in three main directions since it's made with both the lips and the velum. First is purely bilabial. It can sometimes become the voice bilabial fricative v, and in fact, this is a sound change that predated the v to b fortition we talked about earlier with Spanish. It started as w in Latin. But an even more common result of w fortition is to the voice labia dental fricative v, which happened in all of these languages. I've even seen it become the voiceless fricative f in Irish, and then this is rarer, but using its velar component, w could also become g or something along those lines. It's most notable in Old French. And under the right conditions, w can even become m. And this is fortition. Due to completely closing the articulators, nasal consonants are higher up on the hardness scale than liquids. In fact, they're one nasal cavity away from being plosives, which anyone who's ever been congested definitely knows. The language where I've seen this shift is Cherokee. If there was a sequence of w followed by a nasal vowel, particularly in Proto-Iroquoian, then in Cherokee the nasality got passed to the w and it fortified to m. So from Proto-Iroquoian awen, we get Cherokee ama. In Cherokee, m is the only example of a fully labial consonant in any Iroquoian language language, so this is interesting. Finally, the other liquid that fortifies a fair amount is ye. First, it can just become the nearby voiced fricative ye like in Spanish, but it can also become the post-alveolar fricative je like in French, or even harder, the corresponding affricate je, which it did in Italian. So those are the main ways fortition happens in languages. I'll just run through them one more time. First, fricatives that are difficult to pronounce may revert to their more common plosive forms. Chain shifts may also drag a fricative into plosivity if the earlier sound shifts leave a vacancy there. Even just being around a nasal may also encourage a fricative to harden. Then, plosives may be inserted between consonants to break up awkward clusters, while liquids are often inserted between vowels to prevent hiatus. And finally, liquids themselves can harden to fricatives or affricates, with plosives as a possible following step because sometimes active articulator approximation is just too difficult. Got any examples of fortition that I missed? I'd love to hear about them in the comments, but overall, I hope now you're a bit less doomerist about the blobification of languages and are reassured that humans will still be able to understand each other far into the future. Thanks for watching, I'll see y'all next time.